KOSCHEI, a couple of hours before midnight. The sky, which for several days had been threatening with heavy, leaden clouds, finally gave birth to a snowfall, so thick that just a few dozen steps away, through the curtain of fluffy, milky white flakes, some of which were the size of a $10 coin, it was impossible to make out anything but vague silhouettes. It was the middle of February, and this situation didn't particularly please anyone except for the kids who went wild building snowmen, and a few young couples who hadn't yet been cured of their romantic foolishness by the harsh reality of life. But the former were quickly chased home by their dissatisfied mothers due to the late hour, and the latter, in principle, weren't interested in the world around them, being completely absorbed in their love-related experiences. Therefore, no one noticed how an inconspicuous male figure in a black down jacket with a tightly pulled-up hood emerged from the whitish gloom and disappeared into the depths of the first entrance from the corner. Once inside the warm, dark vestibule, the man lay in wait, listening to the sounds of the stairwell. Not hearing anything that caused him alarm, he slipped like a death shadow toward the last apartment on the left, making sure to stay out of sight should anyone decide to look through their peephole. He then froze, hunched over the door lock. The man's name was Andrew, and he had been profiting from apartment burglaries for several years now. It wasn't extreme need or a painful addiction to forbidden substances that pushed him onto this slippery slope, but a mundane desire for a luxurious life and a simple calculation. After the collapse of the United States several years ago and the subsequent decline in economic and social life, Andrew saw no way for a native of a small American town to earn an honest living, not just to have bread, but bread with butter and at least some red caviar. It wasn't that his current occupation allowed the young man to get excessively rich. After all, it wasn't New York, and the people were mostly not wealthy. There wasn't much to gain, but it was enough for girls and restaurants. However, today, as the criminal hoped, he would be able to hit a good jackpot. A reliable informant and old friend, who also ran a den for illegal substances, had given him a solid lead that promised a good profit with minimal risk. As one of his clients had told his friend, a young graduate student or lab assistant at the local Museum of Regional Studies, he and his academic advisor had dug up some incredibly expensive statuette on a recent expedition. After careful consideration, they decided not to give it to the government, but to sell it on their own and split the profit. In exchange for a down payment on the future profit, the fool tried to beg a dose from the drug dealer, which he received as soon as his filthy mouth revealed everything he knew to the informant. Of course, trusting such a person was a last resort, but the lead was very tempting. Andrew and his friends received too much. Andrew always paid his informants a share of the loot, and was always as honest and open with them as possible. The risk was low. What would the museum nerds complain about? That a trinket they themselves wanted to steal from under the government's nose was taken from them. In that case, they'd be the first to end up in the slammer. And a burglar is like the wind in a field. Try finding him. And if you do, try proving it. We've been there. We know how to cover our tracks and who to pay off. The door, obedient to his skilled hand, opened without a creak, and Andrew froze in a daze, staring into the dark corridor, where at the very end of the wall, the reflections of a switched-on television flickered. He had spent the entire day in an old car beneath the apartment windows, and was ready to swear on anything that there had been no signs of life there. The burglar listened intently, straining his ears. The murmuring of the television came from the living room, and nothing else. No one was talking, either old people scolding the incompetent government or simply discussing tomorrow's lunch menu. The floorboards didn't creak, nor did the springs of chairs and sofas under the owner's feet and behinds. No spoons clinked against teacups or bottlenecks against faceted glasses. Nothing. Only the television was mumbling. Andrew knew he had to take action, either leave or do what he came for. Standing still was pointless and dangerous. You never knew who might come into the stairwell late at night. Maybe someone would want to smoke on the landing. After several more agonizingly long heartbeats, greed finally overcame caution. "Hello, owners!" the man called out softly. "Hey, owners! Your door was open. Is everything okay?" He repeated a little louder and froze again, listening. Nothing changed. The television continued to broadcast something in a deathly silence. "Owners," Andrew said with a full voice, emboldened, as he entered and closed the door behind him. Could it be that no one was home and they had just left the boob tube on? On the one hand, it was an incredible stroke of luck. He could calmly search the apartment without the danger of being noticed. On the other hand, a dart of fear pricked him. What if the graduate student had already found a buyer and left for the state capital? They wouldn't sell ancient golden artifacts in this backwater. There were no dealers here capable of pulling off such a deal. The burglar dismissed this last thought as unlikely. First, you couldn't find a buyer that quickly who was willing to pay a decent price. And second, the guy wouldn't take his wife to a dangerous meeting. He wasn't a total simpleton. He understood that if anything went wrong, serious people would take the trinket and send all the witnesses to the cemetery for a long stay. No, that was unlikely. So where had they gone? God only knew. Maybe they went to visit friends to drink away their travel allowance. "Owners!" Andrew called out once more, just in case, as he moved along the carpeted corridor and looked into the first door on the right, which seemed to be the bedroom. A perfectly made double bed was in the center. Nightstands with table lamps, a woman's dressing table in the far corner, a cheval glass with a massive mirror half a man's height. Light from the street lamps fell through the window with the open curtains, allowing him to make out the room's quite rich furnishings. "Ah, the intellectual lives well," a fleeting thought flashed through his mind. It seemed it wasn't the first time he'd hidden valuable findings from government people. If there was time, he'd have to search the closets. Who knows, maybe he'd find some other golden trinket for himself. After all, the deal with the informant was to split the profit only from the statuette. Well, that was for later. For now, Andrew was somewhat disturbed by an unpleasant sickly sweet smell that had appeared in the air as soon as he entered the apartment. A smell that was very hard to confuse with anything else once you had smelled it, and a reality that Andrew didn't want to believe, completely unwilling to get involved with any kind of murder. The smell of a large amount of already congealed blood. After that, the young man moved without much caution. On his way, he inspected the combined bathroom, where cleanliness and order also reigned. The kitchen was empty, furnished with quite modern imported appliances. Then, frightened, he stood by the doorframe to the large living room. The smell of blood was almost unbearable, as if Andrew had once again found himself at the slaughterhouse, where he had worked for a few months in his youth, right after school. Taking a deep breath and casting aside the sudden wave of timidity, he entered the room and literally froze, unable to even make a sound. No, Andrew wasn't a prude or a softy. In his life, he had seen many damn nasty and unpleasant things. And why hide it? Like any child of the late 20th century, he was spoiled by overseas cinema, which was very fond of all sorts of bloody filth. But what he saw horrified him primarily with its implausibility and phantasmagoria, which would have been a credit to any, even the most perverted, product of human imagination. In the room, In front of the working television, there were two deep armchairs, separated by an elegant coffee table covered with all sorts of food. In the right one sat a woman. It would probably not be an exaggeration to say that once she had been dazzlingly beautiful in a long evening dress, shimmering in various shades under the glow of the television screen, with a deep neckline that emphasized her high chest and a light, unobtrusive makeup that only slightly accentuated her Eastern facial features and the shape of her eyes. Or rather, her eye, since the right side of her head was practically missing, splattered in a bloody mess on the sideboard behind her, where once stood the crystal so rare and in short supply in American times, and now only a glass crumb, generously soaked in scarlet and gray, remained. No less horrific was the sight of the occupant, if you could call him that, of the second armchair. A man in a suit and a white shirt with a tie, but with the top half of his head completely missing. Everything that had been above his lower jaw now hung from the ceiling in bloody clumps. Between his legs, the man was clutching a shotgun, a simple grandfather's double-barreled horizontal. Andrew backed away, shaking his head. His breathing became erratic, a lump formed in his throat, and his legs felt like cotton. For some reason, he had a very vivid image of the couple preparing for this event. How the man bought cognac downtown. Judging by the elegant bottle, it was clearly not moonshine diluted with tea, which was sold for a 10 spot in the nearest commercial kiosk. Snacks, fruits, which were not so easy or cheap to get in winter. How the woman had toiled all day over various dishes to prepare a table fit for the most honored guest. How they had put on their best outfits, how they feasted, joked, and laughed, how the husband took out and loaded the shotgun, how he aimed it at his smiling, beautiful wife, and how the first shot rang out. And at that moment, when the burglar, succumbing to the panic, was ready to drop everything and run away headlong, his eyes fell upon the statuette standing on the table between the dead spouses, lost among the cognac bottles and plates of cutlets. Large, the height of a man's forearm, its appearance mesmerized Andrew. Its beckoning golden gleam, even in the reflections of the television, swallowed and drove away his fear. And he, succumbing to insatiable greed, didn't even realize how he had gotten close and how his slightly trembling hand had firmly gripped the base. The statuette was cold to the touch, as if it had just been brought in from the street, from the frost, so much so that his hand instantly stuck to it. A cold electric shock ran through his body, causing a shiver. And at that moment, with a nasty creak that had not been there before, the front door opened. Startled, Andrew turned around, instinctively unzipping his jacket to hide his loot in an inner pocket, and thus missed the movement from the side, when the seemingly dead woman, lunging forward with the speed of a rattlesnake, grabbed him by the shoulder. Sometimes, even the bravest, most reckless person, when faced with things that are beyond the realm of normalcy, gives in to panic. There's nothing shameful about it, as there are things that the human brain simply cannot comprehend, that the human psyche cannot process. This is exactly what happened to Andrew. Frozen in his tracks, he watched in horror as something rose from the armchair, leaning on his arm, wildly rotating its only remaining intact eye and making some kind of otherworldly hissing sound. And looking into that bulging eye, into that face distorted by hatred, covered in blood, and disfigured by the large shotgun pellets, Andrew understood with some inner sense that the unfortunate woman, who had been mercilessly shot a few hours ago by her husband who had lost his mind, was only a puppet, a mask, through which something else was reaching for him, something, the fear of which is hidden in the very depths of our subconscious, in the scariest fairy tales told only in a whisper. Watching this thing approach, as it reached either for his neck or his face, feeling its foul breath on his skin, smelling of decomposition and stale earth, Hearing the wet smack of its blood-filled mouth, Andrew's consciousness desperately beat against the cage that had become his body, frozen in a daze, trying to regain control, trying to save itself. It is unknown what would have happened if at that moment a very familiar sound of a shotgun breaking open hadn't been heard from the left. With its ordinariness and familiarity, this sound broke the ice that had shackled Andrew's body and mind. He jumped back with a scream, pulling the monster hanging on his arm with him, and thus dropping it to the floor. At the same time, he kicked the second armchair with all his might, in which the second corpse was trying to blindly load the shotgun. The armchair tipped over. The creature, which had once been the master of the house, fell forward, dropping the shotgun and spilling the cartridges. The powerful grip still squeezed his shoulder, and Andrew did the first thing that came to his mind. He gripped the statuette he was holding in his left hand more firmly, and hit the monster on the head with force. With a nasty squelch and a crunch, the heavy metal object plunged into the skull, thoroughly denting it inward. The creature hissed like a boiling cauldron, but didn't loosen its grip. Andrew hit it again, and then kept hitting it until the head of what had once been the landlady was completely turned into a bloody mess, and his chest and face were liberally sprinkled with crimson, but cold, droplets. Only then was he able to free his arm. The second creature was still fumbling, crawling on all fours on the floor, and the burglar rushed into the corridor, hoping to make it out. Whoever was standing in the hallway, the man thought, he would clearly be better than two reanimated corpses moving against all the laws of nature. And how wrong he was. Running out of the room, Andrew stumbled in surprise, and painfully slammed his shoulder into the opposite wall. The corridor, which a few minutes ago was no more than a dozen steps long, now seemed to stretch for a good 100, and the doorway was blocked by a strange, hunched, but at the same time, door-filling figure. The figure extended a hand toward Andrew, on the wrist of which some chains were clattering furiously. Contrary to all laws of physics and logic, the hand reached across the entire expanding corridor, grabbed him by the collar, and with ease, as if he were a blind kitten, the monstrous hand lifted the adult, quite large man off the floor and shook him several times, quite painfully. The burglar thrashed desperately, trying to free himself, and after several attempts, he even succeeded, wriggling out of his winter jacket. Dropping to his knees, he crawled on all fours into the nearby bedroom, closed the door behind him, and braced it with his back. For a while, Andrew just sat, leaning his back against the door, trying to figure out what to do. He knew perfectly well that the flimsy door plywood would in no way become a reliable barrier against a creature that had been tossing a person around like a plush toy. Heavy shuffling steps were heard outside the door, each accompanied by the clanking of chains. It felt as if the person walking had heavy shackles on his feet, similar to those shown in movies about the Wild West, but without the attached cannonballs. The steps were getting closer, and with them came the heavy, labored breathing clearly made by that creature, and the suffocating smell of damp earth. Panic began to wash over Andrew again. He frantically turned his head in search of an exit until his gaze fell on the most obvious one. And at the moment when the steps ceased right next to him, and the stale stench seemed unbearable, he, without thinking for a second, jumped to the nightstand, heaved it over his head with a grunt, and threw it with force into the window. The heavy particle-board furniture knocked out the glass along with the frame, and the burglar managed to jump out onto the street before the creature standing behind the door came inside. Jumping over a small snowdrift under the windows, which was fortunately packed tightly enough not to sink in, Andrew frantically rummaged in his pockets for his keys, then rushed to his car. Even as he approached, he realized that the keys were in his jacket, in the horrible apartment he would never return to for all the money in the world, and so he just helplessly pulled on the door handle a few times, grabbed the cursed statuette from the roof of the car, the one that had gotten him into this mess, although he didn't remember when he had put it there, cast a panicked look at the house he had just escaped, and wearily trudged toward the nearby railroad tracks. He hoped to take the shortest route along them to get past 2 blocks, where one of the central, quite busy streets, even at this late hour, began. There he hoped to catch a taxi and get home. Desperate, Andrew had been wandering in the thick, jelly-like, milky white haze for what felt like more than an hour, and still hadn't gotten anywhere. He couldn't tell the exact time, as his wristwatch showed 1:45, just like when he had first entered the deceased archaeologist's apartment. No, it hadn't stopped. The second hand was working like a responsible little bee, circling its orbit. But its other comrades seemed to live a separate life from the rest of the mechanism, and hadn't moved a single division in the time Andrew had been watching. The snow outside was falling even harder. Now, just beyond the boundary marked by the steel rails, an impenetrable gloom began, in which it was impossible to make out the lights of the nearest houses, which, as the man knew perfectly well, were literally 100 steps from the railroad tracks. Andrew tried to get off the road to get to the nearest one and at least warm up a little in the entrance, but as soon as he stepped off the embankment, he sank almost waist-deep into an unusually soft snowdrift and barely got out, with his pants and sneakers full of snow. The situation seemed extremely unpleasant, as it was a winter American night, and even with dry feet, being outside without warm outer clothing was extremely dangerous for his health. In addition, it was then, after struggling in the snowdrift for an unknown amount of time, that he first heard a pursuit behind him. The same slow, heavy steps, each accompanied by the clanking of chains, sounded, it seemed, very close, just beyond the extremely limited circle of visibility. And Andrew ran, not wanting to meet his pursuer at all. He only stopped when his heart was ready to jump out of his chest, and the cold air cut his lungs like a knife. In such weather, he couldn't say for sure how far he had run, but it was definitely more than a block, and he should have already been in the center he had planned to reach, but this didn't happen. Andrew even thought that he had already run past the street, and was now in the city park that started right after it, through which the railroad tracks also passed. But he dismissed this idea, as he had walked in this area many times, and knew that the pine trees there stood so close together that he simply couldn't have missed them. However, he had no other assumptions. He could only be happy that thanks to the run, he had warmed up very well, and could now probably walk quite far without fear of freezing. And also that he was still clutching the golden statuette in his hands, although he had no idea how he hadn't dropped it while getting out of the snowdrift or during his frantic run, but without it, the whole situation and all the fear he had endured would have been completely in vain. While resting, Andrew once again carefully examined his loot and even turned on the small flashlight he carried on his keychain for this purpose. The statuette was indeed golden, and it looked as if it had recently been lovingly and thoroughly washed, as there wasn't even a small piece of dirt anywhere. With amazing accuracy and an incredible amount of detail, it depicted a tall and very thin old man, dressed in rags, hunched almost in half under the weight of his years. His face. Andrew was used to elderly people in works of art being depicted either as wise teachers who had learned all things, or as good-natured, cheerful grandpas. There was neither here. The face of the statuette was filled with pure, unbridled hatred. On the old man's hands, legs, and belt hung scraps of chains, just like those of the strange creature following Andrew and the one, and of this there was now no doubt, who was responsible for the death of the museum worker and his wife. And it became clear why he was chasing Andrew. It was all because of this vile statuette, because of this golden statuette that was probably worth a fortune. When he heard the heavy clanking steps behind him again, Andrew hesitated for a moment, then swung his arm back. His entire being resisted this action, and he threw the statuette back with a scream. "You want this? Take it, you bastard!" Then, turning around, he ran again. He barely managed to jump aside when a huge truck came flying out of the snowy curtain, signaling frantically. Stepping back onto the side of the road, Andrew, afraid to believe his good fortune, looked around and saw that the snowfall had become much less dense. He could make out the outlines of the houses along the road, and the light from the street lamps, and the few windows that were lit at this dark hour broke through. And most importantly, the normal sounds of the night city had returned. Unable to hold back, the man fell to his knees and cried with relief. For a while, he just walked along the street, unable to get enough of the fresh, seemingly sweet air and admiring his beautiful, native town. It's true what they say, only after being on the verge of death do you truly begin to appreciate life. After recovering a bit and realizing that he was still wandering through an American city on a winter night without a jacket, he hailed a passing car that agreed to take him home for a reasonable price. The road was not the shortest, and once in the warm cabin, Andrew dozed off. He was woken by a push on his shoulder that was too hard to be considered polite. Muttering something unflattering about the driver's female ancestors, and without looking, throwing the agreed-upon amount onto the dashboard, Andrew, still slightly dazed after the short nap and the horror he had experienced, got out of the car and had just started walking toward his building when he heard some inarticulate but extremely vile gurgling behind him. Chilled with horror, he turned around and saw that the practically decapitated corpse sitting in the driver's seat, wearing a blood-stained jacket and a white shirt, was holding out a large golden statuette to him. Clamping his hands over his mouth so as not to scream in a completely feminine way, Andrew began to back away from the car until he bumped into the entrance door. Afraid to turn around, he blindly typed the code on the lock with trembling hands. Fortunately, the creature had indeed brought him where he needed to be. Andrew dove into the entrance and slammed the door shut behind him, and then for a long time he just sat, huddled in a dark corner of the vestibule, and listened to the headless archaeologist wandering outside the door, secretly hoping that a police patrol would pass by and, what should follow that, Andrew himself couldn't say, but he didn't care. Whatever the reaction was, the main thing was that it would confirm that everything that was happening was real and not a manifestation of his own madness. At some point, his hand found an object. The cold metal painfully and horribly familiarly pierced his flesh as his hand gripped the base of the heavy golden statuette. As Andrew knew perfectly well, it depicted a thin, evil old man in chains. The panic that had previously possessed the entire being of the former burglar now receded. Its place was filled with doom. Andrew realized that there was no escape for him, that he had no choice, and he understood what he had to do. Wearily shuffling his feet, he went up to his native 6th floor, opened the door of his 3-room apartment with a key, not for a second surprised that behind the door a dark corridor was waiting for him with glimmers of light from a working television, and that cold air was coming from the broken window in the right-hand bedroom. Andrew carefully closed the bedroom door. Why cool down the place unnecessarily? The pipes might freeze. This time, he took off his shoes, picked up the jacket lying on the floor, and hung it on the hanger, and put on the slippers thoughtfully laid out by the hospitable hosts. For some reason, he knew that they had been laid out just for him, and he walked into the room. 3 armchairs were now in front of the television, and, placing the statuette, as was fitting for the image of an ancient god, at the head of the table, Andrew poured himself a large shot glass of cognac, overflowing with a little hill. He toasted the golden old man and both hosts in turn. They, by the way, looked quite presentable with all their missing facial parts. He quickly knocked back the drink, snacking on one of the delicious, albeit slightly dried out, canapes from the plate, and sat down in his designated place. The host sitting to his left, smiling approvingly, handed him the loaded double-barreled shotgun. The hostess sitting to his right, Andrew involuntarily admired her beauty. Well, the bookworm was lucky to get such a hot chick back in the day. She squeezed his hand, offering support. Steps were heard behind him, and Andrew was enveloped in the now even pleasant smell of wet earth. Andrew felt a heavy hand rest on the back of the armchair, and pressed the blackened barrel against his chin. The minute hand on his wristwatch finally moved one division.